A metal dinner pail rests beneath a wooden bench, close enough to the factory floor that a fine gray dust has settled across its lid. Inside are 2 thick slices of bread, a little cold meat, a hard-boiled egg, and a wedge of pie wrapped in paper. A small bottle holds coffee that was hot when the worker left home before sunrise. By noon, the bread may be dry, the coffee may be lukewarm, and the pie may have shifted against the side of the pail. Even so, this meal has been chosen with care. It must survive the walk or streetcar ride to work. It must fit inside a sturdy container, and it must provide enough strength for several more hours beside looms, presses, furnaces, sewing machines, or assembly lines. That simple lunch tells us much more than what one person happened to eat. It reveals the long workday, the wages of the household, the distance between home and factory, the availability of refrigeration, the customs of an immigrant neighborhood, and the growing power of the factory clock. So what did American factory workers actually eat for lunch in the early years of the 20th century? There was no single answer. A steel worker in Pennsylvania, a garment worker in New York, a textile operative in Massachusetts, a cannery worker in California, and a tobacco worker in Virginia did not necessarily carry the same food. Their lunches differed by region, income, family background, season, religion, and the kind of work they performed. Some ate from metal pails, some carried baskets or paper parcels, some bought soup, bread, or coffee near the factory. A smaller number had access to company dining rooms or cafeterias. Others ate wherever they could find a few minutes of space. The period from roughly 1900 through the years around the First World War was one of rapid industrial change. Factories grew larger, cities expanded, millions of immigrants entered the labor force. Women and young people remained important in textiles, garments, food processing, and other industries. Time became more tightly organized around whistles, bells, schedules, and production targets. The midday meal, once connected to the rhythms of a farm or household, increasingly had to fit the demands of industrial work. In 1915, manufacturing employees commonly worked far longer weeks than most factory workers do today. The workday could begin early, end late, and change according to orders and production needs. A lunch interval was therefore not merely a pleasant pause. It was the point at which a worker tried to recover enough energy to continue through the afternoon. The food had to be affordable, portable, filling, and reasonably safe after several hours without modern refrigeration. The result was a lunch built less around novelty than around practicality. Bread mattered because it traveled well. Cold meat, cheese, eggs, beans, potatoes, pickles, and pie appeared because they could be prepared at home and carried without much trouble. Coffee was valued for warmth and alertness, even when it cooled before noon. Leftovers were useful, because nothing in a working household could be wasted casually. A meal might be plain, but it was rarely accidental. To understand these lunches, it helps to begin not with a menu, but with the factory whistle. The whistle decided when thousands of people moved through the gates, when machines started, and when the brief middle of the day arrived. Lunch was shaped by that sound, long before it was shaped by a cafeteria tray or a printed menu. For many industrial workers, the first fact about lunch was that it had a fixed place inside a very long day. The clock did not simply tell time, it organized labor. In older household production, people could sometimes pause when a task allowed it. In a factory, the movement of one worker was tied to the movement of many others and to the pace of machinery. A loom room, rolling mill, glassworks, or sewing floor could not be treated like a private kitchen. The bell or whistle announced when the line of work began, and another signal might release workers for the noon interval. The length and quality of that interval varied greatly. In some factories, workers had enough time to sit, talk, and finish what they had brought. In others, the pause was short, irregular, or vulnerable to changes in production. The timing of lunch could become a labor issue because control of the break represented control of the day. Workers had protested changes to lunch hours in American mills long before 1900, and the question remained important as industrial discipline tightened. An employer who moved, shortened, or interrupted the meal period changed more than a schedule. The worker's body had to adjust as well. A manufacturing employee in the middle of the 1910s might spend roughly 50 or more hours each week at work, although conditions differed by industry and place. Some worked 6 days. Some endured seasonal reductions in hours that lowered their earnings, while others faced exhausting stretches of overtime. In especially demanding trades, a worker could be on the job far beyond what would later become the standard 8-hour day. Under those conditions, the noon meal had to carry practical weight. It was fuel for labor that remained physical even when machines did much of the visible production. The location of the meal was often as important as the food. Not every factory had a clean lunchroom. Workers might eat beside a machine that had finally gone quiet, on lumber stacked near a wall, on a loading platform, in a courtyard, near an open window, or outside the gate. In crowded garment shops, the lunch space might be little more than a corner of the workroom. In heavy industry, men could sit near enormous structures of iron and brick, their pails lined up beside boots and tools. Photographs from the era show that the pause was frequently informal. People sat wherever the workplace allowed. This meant that the lunch itself needed to be manageable. A bowl of delicate food was difficult to carry through city streets and factory gates. A meal requiring a clean table, a knife, several dishes, or careful reheating was impractical. Foods that could be held in the hand had an advantage. So did foods that remained recognizable after being wrapped, pressed, and carried for hours. The lunch break also had a social life. Workers exchanged news, compared wages, discussed supervisors, shared jokes, and sometimes traded food. People from the same neighborhood or language group could sit together. New employees learned the customs of a shop by watching where others ate and how quickly they returned when the whistle sounded. A piece of bread, a pickle, or a slice of cake might move from one lunch to another. Food could make difference visible, but it could also create small forms of fellowship. At the same time, the meal exposed inequality. A skilled worker, earning more, might carry meat more regularly or purchase a hot lunch nearby. A young woman in a low-paid garment shop might have bread, tea, and something left from supper. A child laborer could have a meal prepared by an equally overworked parent or older sibling. A boarder might eat food provided by a boarding house, while a married worker depended on the morning labor of someone at home. Even before the pail was opened, the lunch represented work performed outside the factory. That unseen work often began in darkness. Someone sliced bread, filled a bottle, wrapped a piece of pie, peeled an egg, or scraped yesterday's potatoes into a smaller container. In many households, women performed this labor whether or not they also earned wages themselves. A factory lunch was therefore produced by two clocks, the factory schedule and the household schedule. The meal had to be ready before the worker left, sometimes before the rest of the street was awake. Once packed, it traveled by foot, streetcar, trolley, or train. Many city workers lived close enough to walk, but factories also drew labor from wider districts. The longer the trip, the more important the container became. And in the early 20th century, the most familiar container of industrial labor was not a bright lunchbox decorated for children. It was the plain, durable dinner pail. The phrase dinner pail can sound confusing today because the meal inside was usually eaten around midday. In many working communities, however, dinner could mean the substantial meal of the day, and the container took its name from the importance of what it carried. By 1900, the metal dinner pail was so closely associated with miners, factory hands, and other wage earners that politicians could use it as a symbol of employment and prosperity. A full dinner pail suggested not luxury, but steady work and enough household income to send a worker through the gate with food. The earliest pails were often practical rather than specialized consumer products. Workers reused tins that had once held biscuits, tobacco, lard, or other goods. A handle could turn a durable container into something suitable for the walk to work. Manufactured lunch pails also appeared in different forms, including round metal vessels and rectangular boxes with fitted lids. Some had separate compartments, or an upper section, that kept bread away from wetter foods. Others were no more complicated than a single container in which several parcels were carefully arranged. The metal protected food from being crushed by tools, clothing, or the movement of a crowded streetcar. It also kept factory dust from settling directly on the meal, but it did not provide modern temperature control. The household icebox was becoming familiar in many cities, yet mechanical refrigerators were not standard kitchen equipment. Even when food began the morning cool, the lunch pail itself could not hold that temperature for an entire shift. Workers and the people who packed their meals therefore relied on foods that had long histories of traveling reasonably well. Paper, cloth, and small jars helped separate one part of the lunch from another. Sandwiches might be wrapped in paper or a clean cloth. Pie or cake needed protection from heavier items. Pickles could be tucked into a small container. Coffee might travel in a bottle or in a vessel designed to fit the pail. The modern plastic bag, snap-lid container, and disposable insulated package did not exist. Packing lunch required more judgment and more washing at the end of the day. A brown paper bag was another possibility, especially for lighter meals and for workers whose jobs did not expose the package to rough handling. The growing availability of flat-bottomed paper bags made them useful for carrying purchases and lunches. Yet the paper bag offered little defense against rain, grease, pressure, or the sharp corner of a tool. A sturdy pail remained a visible mark of industrial work, precisely because it could survive repeated use. Baskets also continued to appear, particularly where local custom or the type of work made them practical. A worker close to home might carry food wrapped in a cloth. Some people could return home during the midday break, especially in compact factory towns or when boarding houses stood near the mill. In those cases, lunch might be hot and served at a common table, but urban growth and longer commutes made the portable meal increasingly important. The container affected the menu. Soup was possible only with a secure jar or if it could be purchased hot. Gravy made bread soggy. Delicate greens wilted. Milk could sour. A soft fruit bruised easily. The best foods were compact and forgiving. Thick bread protected fillings. Hard-boiled eggs traveled in their shells. Pickled foods had flavor and durability. A slice of pie came in its own firm crust. Cold potatoes or beans could be eaten without much ceremony. Even when a worker carried leftovers, the leftovers were often chosen because they could be eaten at room temperature. There was also a question of odor. A lunch pail opened in a crowded room announced itself. Cheese, onions, fish, garlic, sausage, and pickles could identify a family's cooking traditions before anyone spoke. Such foods might invite teasing, curiosity, exchange, or recognition. In a factory workforce drawn from many countries and regions, the lunch pail became a small, private household space carried into a public industrial world. Its appearance could reveal years of use. Metal dented, handles loosened, paint wore away. Initials might be scratched into the lid so that one pail was not confused with another. The container returned home each evening to be emptied, washed, and packed again. Day after day, it moved between domestic labor and paid labor. Inside it, bread was usually the most dependable foundation. Bread could turn a small amount of meat, cheese, egg, or leftover food into something that could be held with one hand. The sandwich was not the only factory lunch, but it fit the industrial day so well that it became one of the meal's most enduring forms. Bread in the early 20th century lunch pail might be homemade, purchased from a neighborhood bakery, or bought as a commercially produced loaf. Its texture and shape varied by household. Wheat bread was common in many cities, but rye, cornbread, brown bread, biscuits, rolls, and other regional or ethnic forms remained important. The point was not simply that workers ate bread. It was that bread could absorb the differences of American industrial life. It could hold meat in one home, cheese in another, and nothing more than butter, drippings, or preserves in a week when money was scarce. A meat sandwich could be made from the previous evening's roast, slices of sausage, ham, salt pork, or another cold meat available to the household. Meat was valued, but it was not necessarily present in generous amounts every day. A small portion went farther when placed between thick slices of bread. The same was true of cheese. An egg could be sliced into a sandwich or carried whole. Peanut butter, already commercially available by this period, offered another portable filling, though its use varied, and it had not yet acquired exactly the same place in American lunch culture that it would later hold. Sandwiches prepared hours in advance presented a familiar problem: they could dry out. Period cooking advice offered methods for keeping them moist, including careful wrapping. The very existence of such advice shows how the packed midday meal was becoming a recognized part of modern life. A sandwich was not merely food placed between bread. It was a small piece of household engineering designed to remain edible until the factory whistle released the worker. Not every lunch was arranged as sandwiches. Leftover beans could be carried in a covered tin. Cold potatoes might be sliced or seasoned. A piece of meatloaf or a portion of baked beans could travel if the container was reliable. Cornbread paired well with beans, meat, or vegetables. In some households, a thick wedge of pie served almost as a second source of energy, not merely a decorative dessert. Cake, cookies, donuts, or sweet buns could perform the same role. Pie appears often in descriptions of American working meals because it was familiar, portable, and capable of carrying fruit, pumpkin, mince, or other fillings. A worker who opened a pail containing bread, an egg, and pie did not necessarily see the pie as an indulgence. It might provide calories needed for physical labor. The border between meal and dessert was less rigid when the entire lunch had to fit into one container and last through an afternoon shift. Pickles added sharpness to food that might otherwise seem heavy and plain. Their popularity also reflected a broader world of household preservation. Cucumbers, cabbage, beets, onions, and other vegetables could be preserved through brining or pickling. A pickle traveled well, required no reheating, and helped make repeated meals of bread and meat more appealing. In immigrant households, the specific pickled food could carry a strong connection to regional and religious traditions. Fruit depended heavily on season, place, and income. An apple was one of the easiest fruits to carry. It had its own protective skin and did not require a utensil. Oranges were available through expanding national distribution, but not every household purchased them regularly. Bananas had become more visible in American cities, yet access and price varied. Rural workers might have fresh produce in season, while urban households relied more heavily on market purchases, preserved foods, and canned goods. Coffee was perhaps the most important companion to the food. It could be brewed early, poured into a bottle or metal vessel, and carried into the factory. By noon it might be cool, but it still offered familiarity and stimulation. Some workers drank tea. Others relied on water, milk, or a beverage bought near the shop. Hot coffee could also be purchased from a vendor or lunch counter where such services existed. In cold weather, the desire for something warm could determine whether a worker spent a few coins outside the factory instead of eating only what had been packed at home. The absence of modern refrigeration shaped caution. Foods rich in milk, cream, or mayonnaise could be risky after hours in warm conditions, although people did not always understand food safety in modern terms. A worker in a hot glass factory or summer cannery faced a different problem from someone in a cold New England mill. The season changed the lunch. Winter made it easier to keep some foods cool, but increased the desire for hot coffee or soup. Summer made fruit more available in certain regions but made meat and dairy harder to carry safely. Food prices mattered. In 1915, a 1-pound loaf of bread might cost only a few cents in nominal terms, but wages were also low, and households spent a much larger share of their resources on food than families do today. Butter, eggs, coffee, and meat had to be measured against rent, fuel, clothing, and irregular employment. The lunch pail therefore reflected budgeting. It contained what the family could spare after breakfast and supper had been planned. This is why leftovers were not a sign of careless packing. They were evidence of coordination. A supper of beans could become part of the next day's lunch. A roast served several times. Stale bread could be toasted, soaked, or paired with a stronger filling. A bit of gravy might be absorbed into bread. Nothing had to look fashionable. It had to be useful. Yet usefulness did not erase culture. The same industrial requirement for portable food produced many different lunches, because American factories drew people from many different homes. At the beginning of the 20th century, American industrial cities were filled with neighborhoods in which the sounds, shops, faiths, and cooking traditions of many parts of the world stood close together. Factories depended heavily on immigrant labor, especially in garments, textiles, metalworking, food processing, and construction-related manufacturing. The lunch carried through the factory gate was therefore not simply American food in a narrow sense. It was household food adapted to an American work schedule. An Italian worker might carry sturdy bread with cheese, sausage, peppers, or a portion of food left from supper. A Jewish garment worker might bring rye bread, an egg, cheese, pickled vegetables, or another food consistent with the customs of the household. Workers from Central and Eastern Europe could carry dark bread, sausage, cabbage, onions, or potatoes in forms familiar from home. In communities shaped by German food traditions, cold meats, bread, mustard, and pickles were readily available from neighborhood shops and delicatessens. These examples should not be turned into fixed menus. Income, religious practice, local markets, family structure, and individual preference all mattered. A newly arrived immigrant living as a boarder might eat whatever the household keeper prepared. Another worker might avoid a traditional food at the factory after being mocked for its smell. Someone else might take pride in offering a coworker a taste. Industrial lunchrooms became places where cultural difference was both preserved and negotiated. In the South, factory lunches could include cornbread, biscuits, beans, sweet potatoes, preserved meat, greens left from supper, fried fish, or a piece of pie. African American workers carried food traditions shaped by family, region, migration, and the unequal conditions under which they earned and purchased food. As Black Southerners moved toward industrial cities, familiar ingredients and methods traveled with them. The lunch pail could hold both memory and adaptation. Cornbread beside a store-bought item, or a household dish packed for a new kind of wage work. In the Southwest and parts of the West, Mexican and Mexican-American workers might carry tortillas with beans, meat, chile, or other household foods suited to wrapping and transport. Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, and other Asian workers in Western industries brought their own foodways into canneries, mills, packing operations, and workshops, sometimes carrying rice, preserved vegetables, fish, or other compact foods. Racial discrimination shaped where people could work, where they could live, what they earned, and whether they could use a shared eating space. The contents of lunch cannot be separated from those conditions. Region also influenced ingredients. Workers near fishing communities had access to different foods from those in inland steel towns. Mill workers in New England lived within a landscape of boarding houses, bakeries, and dense factory neighborhoods. Meatpacking workers in Chicago labored near an enormous food industry, but did not automatically enjoy abundant meat at home. Cannery workers handled fruit, vegetables, or seafood on the job, yet their own meals still depended on wages and household resources. Working inside a food plant did not guarantee a varied lunch. Some factory towns retained arrangements in which workers could eat in boarding houses close to the mill. The Lowell system, developed earlier in the 19th century, placed many women textile workers in corporation-associated boarding houses where keepers prepared meals. By the early 20th century, the workforce and housing system had changed, and immigrant families were increasingly important, but the older pattern reminds us that not every industrial lunch was packed. Distance mattered. When work and residence stood close together, a hot common meal was more possible. For urban garment workers, returning home was often unrealistic. A worker might live several blocks or a streetcar ride away, and the lunch interval could be too short to travel, eat, and return. The meal stayed with the worker. In a crowded shop, the smell of rye bread, garlic, fish, onions, coffee, or pickles mingled with cloth dust, machine oil, steam, and the air of many bodies working close together. Food could reveal differences in status inside a single factory. Managers and office employees might leave for a restaurant or eat in a separate room. Skilled workers sometimes earned enough to purchase lunch more regularly. The lowest paid employees were more dependent on food packed at home. Access to a warm room, clean water, or a place to sit could differ according to job, gender, race, and company policy. The household behind the meal also varied. A married man's lunch might be packed by his wife. A young single woman living with relatives could pack her own food after helping prepare breakfast. A boarder might receive food from a landlady. Sisters working in the same factory might share a pail. Children and teenagers sometimes carried lunches packed by mothers who were also taking in laundry, sewing at home, or working for wages. The factory lunch, therefore, belonged to a network of labor larger than the factory itself. Someone baked or bought the bread. Someone waited in line at the market. Someone kept the fire going, preserved vegetables, washed the pail, and planned how one supper could become two meals. When women entered factories in large numbers, especially in garments, textiles, canneries, and food processing, they did not leave domestic expectations behind. Many performed paid industrial labor while remaining closely connected to the preparation of family food. This double burden becomes especially visible when we look at the lunches of women and young workers. Their meals were shaped not only by hunger and custom, but by crowded shops, low wages, seasonal employment, and the constant pressure of time. Women were not a small or unusual presence in early 20th century factories. They formed major parts of the labor force in textiles, garments, canneries, tobacco, and food processing plants. In some of these industries, women outnumbered men. Their wages were often lower, their employment could be seasonal, and their opportunities for advancement were limited. A factory lunch carried by a woman, therefore, cannot be treated as a smaller version of a man's meal. It belonged to a different pattern of wages, household responsibility, and workplace control. New York's garment shops offer one clear example. Many employees were young immigrant women working long hours in crowded rooms. They bent over sewing machines, handled bundles of cloth, and were paid under systems that could reward speed while offering little security. Lunch might be bread with cheese, an egg, fruit, a pickle, or food left from the family supper. Some women bought coffee, soup, or a small plate from a nearby vendor when money allowed. Others ate quickly at the work table because there was nowhere else to go. The lunch interval could become one of the few moments in which conversation escaped the pace of production. Women compared piece rates, spoke about rent and food prices, discussed supervisors, and learned about union meetings. A shared meal did not automatically create political action, but the break provided time in which private frustrations could become collective knowledge. In the garment trades, where workers organized major strikes in the years around 1909 and 1910, the social world of the shop mattered. The lunch itself might also be affected by the need to send money home. A young woman living with her family could contribute much of her pay to rent and groceries. Her own midday meal might be modest because wages were supporting several people. A married woman's income might be described as supplementary even when the household depended on it. In either case, the food in the pail reflected the entire family budget. Children and teenagers were also part of the industrial workforce. Photographs made for the National Child Labor Committee documented boys and girls in mills, glassworks, canneries, and other workplaces, sometimes during their midday breaks. These images do not give a complete menu, but they reveal the youth of the workers and the settings in which they ate. A child might sit on the ground, lean against a wall, or gather with others near the factory. The meal break did not return childhood to someone who had already spent hours at a machine. A young worker's lunch could be bread, fruit, an egg, cake, or whatever the household could pack. It might be carried in a small pail or wrapped parcel. In families where several members worked, morning preparation required coordination. Pails had to be matched to people. Portions had to be divided. The strongest or highest paid worker did not always receive the same lunch as the youngest. Household decisions could reflect age, appetite, job demands, or simply what remained. Food processing factories created a particularly striking contrast. Women and children might spend the day handling oysters, berries, vegetables, candy, biscuits, or canned goods, yet their access to those products was controlled by wages and company rules. A person could pack peaches into cans without carrying peaches for lunch. Industrial abundance existed on one side of the factory system, while household scarcity could exist on the other. Working conditions also shaped appetite. Heat in a cannery or glassworks could make heavy food less appealing and increase the need for water. Textile dust and poor ventilation affected comfort. Repetitive work left hands sore. In some shops, workers had limited facilities for washing before eating. The meal could be consumed in a room where fibers, soot, oil, or other industrial materials remained in the air. Reformers increasingly argued that factories should provide clean places to eat, safe drinking water, washing facilities, and reasonable meal periods. These ideas formed part of a broader progressive-era concern with industrial health and welfare. Yet improvement came unevenly. A large, prosperous company might build a lunchroom. A small subcontracting shop might offer nothing. Even where a dining room existed, workers could distrust employer welfare programs if those programs seemed designed to discourage unionism or increase productivity rather than recognize a right. Still, the movement toward dedicated eating spaces marked an important transition. Lunch was slowly becoming visible as something a workplace should accommodate, not merely a private problem that each worker carried through the gate. That change would become clearer during and after the First World War, when large employers and government investigators paid more attention to industrial cafeterias, nutrition, and employee welfare. Before that system became common, however, workers often depended on the city outside the factory. Around major industrial districts, an economy of inexpensive lunches grew in bakeries, delicatessens, lunch counters, pushcarts, taverns, boarding houses, and small restaurants. A worker with a few coins could exchange the uncertainty of the pail for something hot. The streets around a factory could become part of the lunch system. Bakeries sold bread, rolls, pies, and sweet goods. Delicatessens offered prepared meats, cheese, pickles, salads, and other foods that could be eaten quickly. Small restaurants served soup, stew, beans, potatoes, sandwiches, and coffee. Vendors might sell fruit, hot drinks, or inexpensive items close to the factory gate. The exact choices depended on the city, neighborhood, and spending power of the workers nearby. Buying lunch offered several advantages. The food could be hot. It required no early morning packing. It gave a worker a brief change of surroundings. But even a cheap meal competed with rent, fuel, and household groceries. A few cents spent every workday added up. Many workers therefore combined purchased and packed food. They might bring bread and buy coffee, carry leftovers and purchase soup, or save the bought lunch for payday. In cities with large immigrant populations, neighborhood businesses made familiar foods available. A worker could buy a roll, sausage, bowl of soup, slice of pie, plate of beans, or cup of coffee without entering an expensive restaurant. These establishments helped transform lunch into a public commercial meal. Yet service could still be segregated by race, shaped by gender expectations, or divided by class. Not every worker was equally welcome at every counter. One of the most visible experiments in quick urban dining was the automat. Horn and Hardart opened an automat in Philadelphia in 1902, and a New York location followed in 1912. Customers placed coins into machines and opened small glass doors to retrieve prepared dishes. The system looked modern, orderly, and efficient, qualities that appealed to an age fascinated by machinery. Many dishes were priced in nickels or dimes, making the automat accessible to a broad urban public, though still not affordable as a daily habit for every factory worker. The automat belonged to the same world as the factory, but it offered a more pleasant version of mechanization. Instead of a machine setting the pace of labor, a machine appeared to deliver coffee, pie, beans, or another prepared dish. Behind the wall, of course, cooks and servers continued to work. The polished surfaces and quick service hid human labor in much the same way that a finished manufactured product hid the factory hands who made it. Company lunchrooms developed for different reasons. Employers sometimes presented them as welfare measures intended to improve health, morale, and efficiency. A worker who could eat quickly on the premises was less likely to return late. A clean dining room reduced the practice of eating beside machinery. Nutritious food, employers argued, could support productivity. By the 1920s, federal labor reports were examining lunchrooms in industrial establishments as a recognizable feature of workplace welfare. These facilities varied widely. Some were simple rooms where employees ate food brought from home. Others sold meals at cost or below commercial prices. Larger plants could operate cafeterias with soups, meats, vegetables, bread, desserts, milk, coffee, and tea. There might be separate dining areas for office staff and production workers. In segregated workplaces, race could determine access or seating. A company cafeteria was not automatically democratic simply because everyone worked under the same roof. During the First World War, the scale and urgency of industrial production encouraged more attention to worker feeding. Large plants ran long shifts. Women entered war industries in greater numbers. Government agencies and reformers treated nutrition as a question of national efficiency. Cafeterias, canteens, and organized meal services expanded in some factories. Yet the packed pail did not disappear. For many workers, it remained cheaper, more familiar, and more flexible than a purchased meal. Even when a cafeteria existed, the menu might not suit everyone. Religious restrictions, cultural preferences, and distrust of unfamiliar food mattered. A worker accustomed to food from home could prefer a cold, familiar lunch over a hot institutional meal. The company dining room might also feel like an extension of management, a place governed by rules and schedules rather than a true break from the shop floor. There was another practical concern: time. A worker with a short interval could not wait in a long line. The packed lunch could be opened immediately. It allowed the eater to choose a place, sit with friends, and avoid spending part of the break walking to a counter. In that sense, the humble pail offered a small measure of control. The choice between packed and purchased lunch therefore depended on more than taste. It involved wages, distance, workplace policy, household labor, identity, and the value of time. A hot plate in a cafeteria might appear more modern, but modernity did not always mean freedom. For some workers, progress meant a clean table and affordable soup. For others, it meant keeping the food prepared at home and deciding for themselves how to spend the noon interval. As industrial lunchrooms became more common, The meal also became a subject of advice. Reformers, home economists, and company managers began to discuss what a worker ought to eat. Their recommendations reveal both genuine concern and the era's faith in efficiency. The new language of nutrition did not arrive all at once, and it did not immediately change what workers carried. Around the turn of the century, home economists, settlement workers, physicians, employers, and government officials increasingly tried to describe food in terms of fuel, protein, calories, cleanliness, and efficiency. The language was modern, but the advice often returned to familiar foods: bread, milk, eggs, beans, meat, vegetables, and simple desserts. For working families, the difficulty was not always knowing that a varied meal was desirable. The difficulty was paying for it, storing it, preparing it before dawn, and keeping it safe until noon. A model lunch suggested in a classroom or company bulletin could assume access to ingredients, time, and clean containers that a real household did not possess. The factory worker's meal was judged by reformers, but it was produced under conditions reformers did not always share. Employers could use nutrition programs in complicated ways. A clean cafeteria and an affordable hot meal offered real benefits. At the same time, a company might speak of worker health because a well-fed employee produced more and missed fewer shifts. Industrial welfare could improve daily life, while also extending management's interest into eating, recreation, housing, and family habits. Workers understood that generosity and control could exist together. The meal itself remained stubbornly personal. A supervisor could build a lunchroom, but could not erase the taste of a family's bread or the meaning of a food carried from home. The pail preserved a connection between the factory and the household. When it opened, the industrial worker encountered something prepared beyond the company's authority. That connection helps explain why lunch was rarely identical from one day to the next, even when it appeared repetitive from a distance. Monday's pail might contain Sunday's roast. Tuesdays could hold beans and bread. Later in the week, as money and leftovers declined, the meal might become simpler. Payday could bring meat, fruit, or a purchased hot dish. Seasons altered what was available. Religious observance altered what was appropriate. A family illness, a rent payment, or a period of reduced hours could change the contents without leaving a written record. Most of these meals vanished without documentation. No one photographed every sandwich or listed every portion of potatoes. Historical records preserve factory reports, cookbooks, household budgets, advertisements, menus, reform surveys, and photographs of workers at rest. Together, they show patterns, but not a universal plate. The honest answer must therefore remain broad. Factory workers relied heavily on portable foods prepared at home, especially bread, cold meat or cheese when affordable, eggs, beans, potatoes, pickles, fruit in season, pie or cake, and coffee. Some purchased soup, sandwiches, baked goods, or inexpensive plates near work. Some ate in boarding houses or company dining rooms. Many combined these options. What united the meals was not one recipe. It was the problem they had to solve. Food had to cross the distance between home and factory. It had to endure time without dependable refrigeration. It had to fit a wage earner's budget. It had to be eaten inside a break controlled by the clock. And it had to sustain a body through work that was often noisy, repetitive, hot, dusty, dangerous, or physically demanding. Over the following decades, the solution changed. Factory cafeterias expanded. Vacuum bottles became more familiar. Refrigeration improved. Packaged bread, sliced meats, commercial snacks, and standardized lunch containers reshaped the meal. The decorated lunchbox later became associated with school children, but its industrial ancestor remained the plain pail of the wage worker. The lunch break itself also became more formal through legislation, collective bargaining, and workplace practice. Though progress was uneven, and never automatic. What had once been a pause granted or altered by management increasingly came to be treated as a normal part of the workday. The history of lunch is therefore partly a history of time. Who controlled it, who could rest, and whether a worker had enough minutes to eat with dignity. Return for a moment to the metal pail beneath the bench. The lid has been opened. The worker has eaten the bread, the egg, the cold meat, and perhaps the pie. A few crumbs remain in the bottom. The coffee bottle is empty. Around the room, other workers close their containers, fold paper around what remains, and rise when the signal calls them back. The scene is easy to overlook because nothing spectacular has happened. No banquet has been served. No famous recipe has been created. Yet the meal has connected several worlds. It began in a kitchen where someone planned around wages and leftovers. It traveled through a neighborhood shaped by migration and local markets. It entered a factory governed by machines and schedules. For a few minutes it gave the worker nourishment, familiarity, and perhaps conversation with the person sitting nearby. American factory workers in the early 20th century ate lunches that were practical before they were picturesque. They carried sandwiches, eggs, cheese, cold meats, beans, potatoes, cornbread, pickles, fruit, pie, cake, and coffee, in combinations determined by household resources and tradition. They bought soup, bread, or a hot plate when money and location allowed. They ate in courtyards, workrooms, boarding houses, small restaurants, automats, and the first generations of company lunchrooms. The details varied, but the need was shared. These meals also remind us that industrial history did not happen only through inventions, strikes, production totals, and famous business leaders. It happened through ordinary decisions made before sunrise. How thickly could the bread be sliced? Was there enough meat for both supper and tomorrow's pail? Would an apple survive the journey? Could a few coins be spared for hot coffee? Would the whistle allow enough time to finish eating? The answers were repeated millions of times and rarely written down. Still, they shaped the working day. A lunch could make the afternoon more bearable. A shared piece of cake could begin a friendship. A clean lunchroom could represent a modest improvement. A shortened break could become one more reason to organize. The meal was small, but it stood at the meeting point of labor, family, culture, technology, and time. By evening, the empty pail returned home. It might carry the smell of coffee, onions, metal, or factory dust. It would be washed and left to dry. Before another dawn, it would be filled again with whatever the household could provide. And so the history of the factory lunch ends where it began, not at the assembly line, but at the kitchen table. A few pieces of food wait beside a dented container. Outside, the street is still dark. Soon the factory whistle will sound, and the pail will begin another quiet journey through the industrial day.